Hi everyone, I'm very excited to finally show you this Geonodes setup for curves because it's something that I use pretty much every day because it's so versatile. So let's start with installing it. Now you can either link or append it in, and I'm going to link it in just because I know I'm never going to move the root file. So navigate to the file that you downloaded, which is this blend file, and choose Node Tree and GeoCurve Extrude. That is the source one. Now obviously it only works on curves, so let's create a curve. Let's just do regular Bezier. I'm gonna scale it up a little just so we can see it. And right now we don't need the camera. All right, so let's go to Add Modifier, add Geonodes, and now we can choose GeoCurve Extrude. And by default, it has just created a flat path. Now to see better what we are doing, I'm gonna turn on the wireframe. And so now we can see how this curve has been subdivided. It's pretty low poly, partly because the original curve only has a resolution of 12. If I turn that up, we get a lot more detail in the curve itself. Now in the Geonodes settings, we can also resample the curve here in the curve settings, and that will let us add tons more detail should we need it. And often I find we do. So let's do a quick rundown of all the settings in the Geonodes setup here. The first panel affects the curve itself. For instance, resample curve lets you adjust the detail and resolution of the curve itself. Profile settings lets you choose the various kinds of profiles that come with it. Radial is very useful, and you can set it to 4 for a square or set it higher for pipes. Profile diameter does about what you'd expect. You can also, of course, go into the individual point radiuses and change them as well. Stretch X and Y here. If we say we have a square shape, stretching X and Y lets you change it from a perfect square to a rectangle. It'll work with circles too, if need be. And custom object, you can actually pick another curve. Let's make one. Let's make a polygon, scale it down, and say that is our custom object. But you have to make sure that it is not set to fill, or else it won't consider it a curve. Cap settings, if you have something radial, you can add a cap to it and set its material and change its UVs. And now UV coordinates. And this is where this setup is very powerful. Let's do an example to show you. So say I want this curve to be train tracks. Well, first I'm going to turn down the profile segments. We only need 2 for a flat profile. And let's go into the shader window. And I'm going to create a new material, call it tracks. And now it won't be assigned automatically. I have to go into the curve material setting here and assign it. All right, it doesn't look like anything yet. Fortunately, I have a train tracks texture already built. So I'm going to open that texture up. Here we are, train tracks. And I'm going to apply that as the base color. Now to make this work properly, we have to give it a UV vector input. And we're going to call it UV map. That is the primary UV export from the Geonodes setup. So now, when I connect it to the base color, all right, we see tracks. And over here in the UV coordinate settings, we can affect the tiling of the tracks, and we can affect the offset if we need, offset on the Y. And what's very great about this is that this tiling will be the same even if we create new splines. So I'm going to draw another spline. It's shorter, but look at that. No matter how short or long it is, the train tracks stay at a consistent size. And the reason they're doing that is because I've got this correct spline length checkbox. And without it, you can see all the tracks end up stretched based on how far apart their points are and how long the curve is. So correct spline lengths, very useful for this. All right, now let's look at something a little more interesting. I'm going to create another curve. And let's say I want to have marching arrows go along the curve. So I'm going to create a new material and call it arrows. And I have an arrow texture that we can use for this. All right, now I don't actually want this to be a color. I want it to be the alpha for a mix shader because I want the arrows to be on a clear background. So I'm going to make a transparent BSDF and a emission shader. Let's create the geometry nodes and the UV map channel, which again is UV map, and assign this arrows texture. And to make things run faster, I'm going to switch the render method from dithered to blended. All right. And to make these arrows move, we can actually animate the offset on the UV coordinates. So I'm going to create some keyframes. I'm going to pull out the timeline and create a keyframe at the start and at the end. So that's getting them moving. Let's interpolate as linear. And there's a few things we can do in here as well. For instance, the segmentation of the curve is still a little low. Let's do resample. It is also low because of the resolution, so turning that up as well. Now we got some smoother curves. When I play this, the arrows move. Let's adjust the tiling a bit. And we can speed up the arrows by adjusting just how far the offset goes. And what's great about this is I can, in edit mode, just draw however many curves with arrows I would like, or start the other way, do that. Now one thing you will notice is that all the arrows pop out at the exact same time and move at the exact same locations. But if that is something you don't want, there's a randomize option down here. So if I turn that up, it will move the UVs on each of the individual splines so they are slightly offset from each other, and so that creates a randomization. There's also a randomize X tool, which I don't recommend for arrows here, but it will give you additional variety if you need it. So now, what if we don't want the arrows to pop into existence right at the edges? Well, we can feather them in our shader. The UVs we are using won't work for that, but there is a second UV channel created by this Geonodes setup. So let's take a look at that. Instead of UV map, this one is called UV map uniform. And the UV map uniform channel stretches with the length of the curves so that any image you put on it, let's do a gradient, will always be the length of the curve. All right, so here's a gradient. I want to rotate that. I'll just use vector mapping. Rotate it 90 degrees and shift it up to 1. All right, so this gives us a black to white gradient, and with a color ramp, I can make it brightest in the middle and make the edges dark. And so if I mix this with my arrow texture, I'll do a multiply. You could also mix it with a math node. Now the arrows fade in, and so that's a much more gentle approach. And we can actually animate the arrows come out with a similar method. We can take our uniform map again. In fact, I'm gonna duplicate all of this and mix it again. So I want half of this to be dark and half of this to be light. Like so. So now only half the arrows appear, even though the entire spline is still there. And if I animate the X location of the UV, we can animate them on. So at frame 0, I want this to be completely obscured. And then say at frame 100, completely visible. Here are those keyframes. I want them to be linear. Now what do we get? Look at that. So those are some useful examples for a flat curve. Let's look at a different kind of curve. Let's look at the cross curve. So I'm going to create a new line, hide these, and I'll make a laser, because a laser is a very good example of when to use a cross curve. So here in Geonodes, we will add the Geonodes Curve Extrude and switch it to cross. And cross makes a flat curve at the z-axis and at the x-axis. So that no matter where you're looking, except for directly head-on, you get some depth. And to create a laser, I'm going to create a new material, call it laser, and assign it here. And a laser is going to be a combination of an emission and a transparent shader. So once again, I will be making use of that UV map uniform into a gradient with a color ramp on it. So if I apply that now, you can see the edges of the gradient are happening. I want for laser the brightest part, the most opaque part, to be in the middle, fading out to the edges. And I want to make this very extreme. So I'm going to do an RGB curves and really cut down that middle. And so you can already see it's sort of got a sort of glow effect. And we can up the strength of that. Now if I want this to be colored, I'm going to, instead of just having white, I'm going to make a mix color. And I'm also going to use this map as a factor between, say, a red and a white highlight. So if I apply that in here, all right. We have a laser that works in almost every angle, except obviously from the extreme angles here. Now there's a few more things we can do to make this look like a laser, and that is adjust the actual color data so that there's some noise in it. So let's create some noise. I'm going to make some room. I'm going to add my UV map. The regular UV map, because I want it to be affected by the length of the curves. Let's create a noise texture. I'm going to turn off normalize because I want the midpoint to be 0. And I'm going to mix it with my current output and blend it together in the color. And look at that, we're getting some noise in here. I can adjust the size. And to make it a little more contrasty, I'm going to add a color ramp. And clip it so that we're getting some sharpness in that shape. And in the Geonodes settings, I can adjust the tiling and adjust the overall scale of the noise until I just basically have a few highlights here and there. And then we could animate this, of course. We could make it a 4D map and animate the W data block. So it looks like that. We could also use a vector math and animate the Y position along the curve. Similar to animating over here with the offset of the Y, but it's also doable in the shader. So if I move that, you can see the laser noise effect travels along the beam. All right, so now let's look at some 3D applications of the curve effect. So I'm going to create another line and scale it so it's just vertical. And I'm going to make a brick chimney out of this. So let's create the geonodes and apply the Geocurve Extrude. And we can turn the diameter way up. Don't want it flat, we want it radial. A little too fat, so that's about chimney sized. Can turn up the detail on the profile. And I'm going to make a chimney that's somewhat tapered, so I'm going to change the upper radius down a little bit. And I want this to be brick, so I'm going to create a brick texture. And I could use the one that comes with Blender, but I would rather use a photograph of bricks. So UV map to image texture. Let's find that texture of a brick. Here we go. Here's a brick texture and link that. And to make it pretty, I'm going to also use it for the bump map. And let's assign it over here. All right, we got brick texture on here. Bump map's still a little high. Cool. Now bricks are pretty rough, so I'll turn up the roughness. And if I wanted a square chimney, I could of course make the profile segments 4, and that gives me that. And once again, the great thing about this setup is I can duplicate and scale chimneys however I see fit, and as long as I have correct spline links on and say randomize, I can create any number of chimneys really quick, and they will all be slightly different. And let's make them round again. Cool. All right, let's look at one more example, and that would be making wood beams, because that is also a very useful feature of this setup. I'm going to make this a flat line and add the Geonodes Curve Extruder. And a wood beam is going to be radial with 4 sides. And we need a wood texture, so let's create a wood texture. And once again, I'm going to use the UV map that's generated by this setup to an image texture. Here's some wood. And let's assign that here. All right. Now my wood texture is horizontal, but it's the y-axis that is the length of the curve. So I'm going to rotate it. I've got a UV angle node here. Let's rotate that texture 90 degrees. And we can mess with the X and Y until we have decent shape. All right. This is square. A wood beam, I want a like 2x4 scale. So that's closer to 2x4. And now we need to cap the ends, right? Because it's currently hollow. So if I hit cap ends, we get a cap, but we also need to assign that material, the wood material. Cool. And I can adjust the scale of the cap UVs. I can rotate it if need be. All right, so now I have a wood beam. And of course, I can make a bunch of wood beams. Say I want to make a whole frame of a house. I can do that all within the exact same object. I just have to scale my wood beams as I see fit and duplicate them however many times I need a wood beam. So say this is the roof. Let's make a standard roof framing. All right. I got one side of a house. A roof frame is going to have a bunch of these. So I'm just going to duplicate them. And right now just do a very rough shot, so we just get a few. You could go and actually properly array these with geonodes as a separate geonode setup. But for now, this is going to be the quickest way to do this. And give us a final set of walls. Cool. And now I want to make sure that I've got randomize on so that each piece of wood looks slightly different. This is a great use case for the randomize x-axis. So again, each piece of wood looks entirely different. Now, if I want to create even more randomization, there's another node I can do in the shader to give each piece a slightly different color. So I'm going to mix color. And I'm going to create an attribute set to curve ID. Curve ID is exported by the Geonode setup and gives each piece a slightly different value. So if I mix that with overlay, some pieces will be darker than others. See the difference? So that's a very useful way of creating even more variety. Again, that is curve ID. And so yeah, you can see just how versatile and useful this setup is, especially if you need to create stuff like this where there's a lot of variety, but you don't want to have to manually tweak individual objects, individual curves, just to get the variety you need. And speaking of wood, let's look at one last use case. I'm going to create a new curve, and I want this to be more of a log. So I'm going to create the Geonode setup, set this to radial, and let's create a bark material with UV map, set to an image texture, and here is a rough wood texture that can serve as our bark map. So let's apply that material in the geonodes, and let's adjust the tiling. All right, so that's barky wood, but of course we need to cap it. And here's where having a separate material option for the cap really pays off, because I can create a new material. Let's call it wood end, and add a UV map to an image texture. And in my wood textures, I have this texture, which is exactly what it would look like at the end of a split log. Apply that. All right, and apply the material to the cap. All right, there's our cap texture. And we have a couple options here. We can scale it so that we're making sure that it fits. And if we randomize this, if we have multiple curves, we'll get slightly different angles on it. We can also manually rotate it if we need be. All right. So that is a breakdown of all the things that this Geonodes setup can do. I don't know, I find this super useful in so many things that I do, and I'm hoping that you will find it useful as well. All right, thank you. Bye.